After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. The 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked together. Isaac said to his father, "Father Abraham, Father," and he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham!" And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." This is God's good word for us, God's beloved people. Thanks be to God. Amen. So, we all developed strange habits and hobbies during the pandemic. For a lot of people, their new strange hobby was, I'll admit, not coming to church. That is not for professional reasons, that is not the one that I developed. I also did not take up gardening. I kill every plant that I've ever touched. I did not take up baking. That aspect of cooking remains mysterious to me. I, like everyone else, did fill my house with junk that I don't need and still don't. But the big thing that I took up is watching documentaries about cults. This was my new pandemic hobby, was watching, and then, there's a whole, I was going to say cult following. There's a literal cult following for cult documentaries. Every streaming service has a couple. And part of the way I work my way through streaming services is working my way through their cult documentaries, right? Amazon has the one about the multi-level marketing scheme, LuLaRoe. Netflix had Leah Remini's one on Scientology. Let's see, HBO Max had one on Nexium, someone had one on Luz del Mundo, someone had a bunch of ones from Korea that were translated from Korean that I'd never heard of. But I've watched enough of these. Watched one this week on Amazon, Happy Shiny People, about the Duggars and Gothardism. Right? I've watched enough of these that they all seem to have a plot. They all seem to play out essentially the same way. And you end up in each of these with this statement of, well, what they asked me to do sounded strange, but this person, people, individual spoke for God, or spoke for the divine, or spoke for Xenu? I forget who runs Scientology, don't worry. It's all about implanted aliens in your psychology. I have no idea. This entity who speaks for this other entity told me it's okay, told me to do it, told me this was salvation, told me this is what I had to do, and so I did it, went along with it, let it happen to other people, fill in the blank, right? But they all boil down to, there is an emotional interview with a former follower, victim, usually kind of half one, half the other, right? Who says, this person spoke for divine truth. Part of me thought this sounded strange, bad, wrong, immoral, horrific. But I went along with it, did it, whatever, because they spoke the divine. That sentence structure sits at the heart of a lot of spirituality gone horrifically wrong. You look at anything that has turned into something we call a crisis or scandal of faith, you will find at the core that sentence structure. This person speaks for God, in the case of cults often, claims to alone speak for God. They asked me, put me in a situation that didn't feel right, sound right, whatever, but I went along with it because that's what the religion told me, right? This is not just at the heart of cults, it sits at the heart of, some of the terrible church abuses that have happened too, is that sentence structure. And why I bring this up is I do not want us to tell the story of the binding of Isaac this way. Because we open ourselves up for the wolves among us when we tell the binding of Isaac in that structure, right? And the traditional read of the binding of Isaac tells the story that way. That God told Abraham to kill Isaac. Abraham might have thought it's wrong, doesn't actually say either way. We get very little bit about Abraham's internality in this one. And he was definitely going to do it, and God stopped him. This is how we tell this story often. And actually, frankly, if you tell it that way, this is not so much a Bible verse as a horror movie with a happy ending. It even has, the pacing of a horror movie, right? Genesis creates the entire world in, a chapter and a half. This is 14 verses of one narrative, right? The narrative of Genesis often moves very quickly. In the beginning was God, right? And then he spoke all of light into existence in a verse. He's created all of the animals in a couple of verses, all plants in 2 more verses. But here, 14 verses on one scene. So we have slowed it way down, and it's got really good horror movie pacing if you tell it this way, right? You have, he prepares the implements, but no one knows really what he's doing. He then lies to his men. Oh, don't worry, we'll be back. It's all going to be fine. We'll be back, He lies to his son, right? When his son asked, hey, Dad, I've noticed we're missing something. Oh, don't worry, son. We're not missing anything. Abraham starts to sound like a psychopath, slowly building towards a thing that thankfully God stops him from doing. But God also sounds like a psychopath for requiring it. I'm here to tell you, friends, this is not a horror film. It is paced like a horror film, but it's not a horror film with a happy ending. This is a story of a man who really understood God, who had really deep faith in the character of God, that said, what I'm hearing doesn't sound right. I know God better than that. I bet this is going to work out differently than it looks. That this is a test of Abraham, yes. But the test isn't, are you willing to kill your child? The test is, do you know that the true God is different from a religion that requires child sacrifice, which was, by the way, a thing 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. This story is 5,000 years old. It was written down 2,800 years ago. And why it wasn't written down at the time is because written Hebrew didn't exist at that time. This story predates written Hebrew. Right? This is, cast your mind back for some of us a couple of decades, for some of us significantly more than a couple of decades. If you cast your mind back to middle school, high school history, you remember learning about the ziggurats and Sumer? Yeah, it's around that time, right? Very few people are writing in cuneiform when this story originates, right? So this is extremely old, and this is from a time where there was human sacrifice in the name of idols, right? And so the actual test that is being played out here is not, will Abraham kill his child, but does Abraham realize that God is different? The true divinity, the true nature of God is far different than what humans thought the divine wanted at the time. Does Abraham know fully who God is? And so then, rather than sounding like a sociopath planning to kill somebody, he's just telling the truth to the two groups that he interacts with as he greets them, right? When he's talking to his servants, that he leads them and says, me and the boy will be back. What if Abraham's telling the truth? What if Abraham knows that he's coming back? What if instead of we just assumed this whole world where Abraham is a pathological and stone-cold liar, maybe instead he's a faithful man who knows this is going to play out differently than it looks. He's telling the truth when he says, don't worry, we're going to go worship, and me and the boy will be back. Fear not. Because the real key, if you decide that Abraham is a faithful, truthful man and not a sociopath, happens right in the heart of this, picking up in what I believe is verse 6, but I'll correct myself if I'm wrong. Picking up verse 7 and 8. Isaac said to his father, Abraham, Father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walked on together. Isaac is of an age where he can probably outrun Abraham. Abraham's like 110 when this story is happening. And so if Isaac was worried, Isaac could have run at any moment, right? We imagine, right, because, this is how we picture, I'm 37, my son is 8, right? It's a coin flip, who can outrun who, right? But this is an 110-year-old man and like a 10-year-old, okay? So the 10-year-old's going to win every foot race all of the time. Right? I love my brothers and sisters who have made it to a century plus, but, foot races, perhaps not their strong suit. They'll kill you at cribbage. Their Scrabble knowledge is deep. The 100-meter dash, not the thing, right? So Isaac clearly trusts his dad when he says, yeah, I know this looks strange, but don't worry. God's going to provide. And Isaac, again, trusts his father to lay down on the thing, allow himself to be bound. This is a 110-year-old versus a 10-year-old. Again, 10-year-old, my 2.5-year-old can squirm out of my grip. I'm 37, she's 2.5. The math is in Isaac's favor this whole time. Isaac trusts. So what if Abraham's telling the truth? What if Abraham really believes that God is different than the surface circumstance looks like? That God is better than what humanity assumed divinity was like. And then God would never actually make him do that. And then, by the way, that's exactly what happens. A ram is provided. The sacrifice is made. They do make it back to their two servants waiting. They do go home. And the covenant that was promised would be passed on to Isaac was passed on to Isaac and to Jacob and on, frankly, to all of us. The key to this story to me is certainly Abraham's faith. And Abraham's faith is tested. But this is faith as the knowledge of the goodness and righteousness of God. Did Abraham know God to be better than what humans assumed divinity was like or not? And the answer is yes. Abraham, as I read this, as the author seems to read this, as someone not poisoned by 20th century horror films seems to read this, this is a man who knows who God really is. And so he is able to trust in God in difficult and weird and things that don't seem quite right, because at its core, he knows what God would really ask him to do and what God would really not ask him to do. It is that depth of knowledge of God. To know the goodness and righteousness of God for ourselves is a way to prevent ourselves from being led astray. And so at the core, weirdly to me, this is a story about discipleship. This is a story about the importance of discipleship. For us to know God well enough in our own souls, to know the kinds of things that God would ask us to do, and the kinds of things that God would not ask us to do. And that helps us when we are put in positions where people tell us, God says X, God wants you to do Y, you can know in your own soul, really? Really? Is that how God works? Maybe. And sometimes God asks us to all do crazy things, but immoral things? Wrong things? But the only way we know the difference between the goodness of God and being led astray is to know God for ourselves, to claim the life of faith for ourselves, to seek God independent of other people telling us what God thinks. As someone who, periodically claims to state to y'all what I think God thinks, I'm telling you, read me with a grain of salt. Read all people in my position with a grain of salt. Certainly take in that information, evaluate it against your life experience with God, and let that be what leads it. But when we outsource that, we open ourselves up to be led astray. Abraham knew God deeply, and that is what was shown in this story. Then even as other folks looked at him, and even his son is like, sure about this, Dad? This sure looks weird. And he's like, no, don't worry, son, it's okay. In a way that Isaac believes him and goes along with the whole thing and plays this whole scene out. And was indeed. Walks out alive. We got to seek God in our own lives for ourselves. Certainly, communal worship is a part of that. Certainly, I believe good preaching is part of that, and I, devote a good chunk of my life to trying to make that happen. But in the end, I can't save anybody. And I can't truly tell anyone who God is. I can only do my part to relate what I know, what I have seen, what I feel, what I have studied. In the end, that's a thing that has to happen within all of us. Because if we don't take that on for ourselves, we open ourselves up to simply go along with whatever we're told from outside. I like the concept of confirmation. Anytime I have the opportunity to teach a confirmation class, I take it. And this is where we take young folks, just as they're kind of coming into their real, ask a lot of questions about the world phase, so 11, 12. We usually do it 6th grade, but I've done it as late as high school, right? Usually starting youngest is about 11 through about, 16, 17. And the concept of confirmation in our tradition is not one of dictates. It's not a lot it is some of hey, this is how we think the world works, but this is how we think the world works and why. What questions do you have? And often this builds to them, these young folks, coming to take on for themselves what they believe. And then what theoretically happens on a confirmation Sunday is these young folks standing up in front of the church and saying, it's no longer going to be my parents telling me just who God is. It's no longer going to be the pastor or the children's director or the whoever telling me who God is. I am going to seek God for myself. This is what I have found so far, and this is the journey that I will take on for me. But friends, that's a journey of a lifetime. so that we can know God deeply. And so that when we hear a voice, whether within ourselves or external to ourselves, saying this is what God wishes us to do, you have something to back-check that against. A lifetime of experience with God to know, yes, that sounds in line with the character of God. Or no, that does not sound in line with the character of God. This is why, part of why, we do discipleship. So that we will know God for ourselves. And so that we can navigate a complicated world by knowing the goodness and righteousness